Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and this is your year ahead horoscope and astrology forecast for the zodiac sign of Pisces for the entire year of 2025. So, my horoscopes are meant to be looked at from the perspective of either your sun sign, if your sun is in Pisces, or especially your rising sign, if your rising sign is in Pisces. And I'm going to give kind of a big picture overview of some of the major trends and themes in the coming year. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. So here's the planetary movements calendar, which shows where the planets will start at the beginning of the year and how far through the signs of the zodiac they'll get by the end of the year, which shows that there's kind of a clustering of planets in certain sectors of your chart that's going to be relevant and that we're going to talk about during the course of this year. Here's some of the main points that I'm going to touch on during the course of this forecast, just to give you an idea of some of the things I'm going to talk about. And here are some dates that you can refer back to later if you want more specifics about the time frames of any of the transits that I'm talking about later on. All right, so let's jump into the first transit I want to talk about, which is the Mars retrograde that we open the year with, especially for the first 4 months of the year, which is in your 6th house of work and health, and your 5th house of children and hobbies and sex and sexuality. So Mars retrogrades can be kind of tricky because they can bring up some tensions in these areas of our life that can be a little bit challenging to deal with. And this really started especially in December of 2024. So just in the past few weeks, Mars turned around and did a U-turn and stationed retrograde in the sign of Leo in your 6th house of work and health. So sometimes this can indicate a period where we're encountering tensions or conflict or difficulties in our workplace with respect to our work and sometimes with people that we work with. So sometimes this can be kind of a tense period where you're dealing with some of these things, and sometimes you have to deal with people that are being more combative than usual in the workplace. Sometimes this can actually lead to or precipitate a separation or a severing or even quitting your job as a result of some of these tensions arising around this time. So it's a good idea to be careful and exercise caution when it comes to getting into conflicts because they could become bigger than you might expect at first. The 6th house also pertains to our health, so it's a good period to be extra cautious because there can be some health issues that arise at this time, or sometimes accidents or injuries. Mars is related to inflammations and things that are like hot and burning and things like that. So if this has already sort of come into play for you over the course of December, if there have been some health issues that have come up, it's something where by early January, Mars is going to retrograde out of that sign and go into your 5th house. So there will be some alleviation of that at that point, which is good news. So at the beginning of January and for the first 4 months of the year, Mars is going to retrograde back into your 5th house. In the 5th house, the primary ancient topic that it's always signified in astrology is the topic of children. So sometimes this means that there can be some issues or some challenges that arise within the context of the general theme of children in your life at this time. So if you have children already, sometimes this can be a period in which you're having some conflicts or some difficulties with them for some reason that are extended or drawn out as a sequence of events over especially the first 4 months of this year. It can also be a period in which other topics related to the 5th house are sex and sexuality. So sometimes there can be some tensions in this area, especially if we have like a spouse or if we're in a romantic partnership. Sometimes this can indicate a period where this is not going as smoothly as other times in our life. And sometimes we may have fights or discord or even experience like a separation romantically as a result of some of these 5th house topics. So that'll be good to pay attention to and just to exercise caution. For some of you, it can be more constructive, especially those of you with night charts. This may just be a period in which you're putting extra emphasis on themes having to do with work, health, and children, and possibly sex and sexuality. So that can be a perfectly good thing. Sometimes because it's a retrograde, it can have to do with revising or revisiting the past, or even a person coming back into your life from the past that plays a significant role in this area of either the 6th house or the 5th house. So that's going to be especially prominent for the first 4 months of the year. The good news is that later in the year, starting in June, the planet Jupiter is going to move into Cancer, and it's going to move into your fifth house not long after Mars has departed from that sector of your chart and completed that transit. So I think this is really good news because it means for the entire second half of the year, whatever dust Mars kicked up in your fifth house in the first 4 months, Jupiter's going to come in and smooth things over and clean things up in that area of your life for the entire second half of 2025, all the way into the first half of 2026. So this can be a great period for topics like children. Either some people, when they have Jupiter transits in the fifth house, if they don't have children, sometimes they can get pregnant or have children at that time. For those that have children, it can be a period where your relationship with them is going particularly well, or they're experiencing some moment of success in their life for some reason over the course of that year-long period. It can also be a good period for sex and sexuality, where you might be exploring new things and enjoying that area of your life more than usual. The fifth house can also pertain to fun and games and leisurely activities, which includes things like hobbies. So this would be a good transit to take up and to explore a new hobby under, starting in June of 2025, all the way through the second half of the year, because sometimes when we explore the fifth house and we find new things that bring joy and pleasure into our life, it can really make life much more worth living and much more enjoyable, especially if there's other areas of our life that are a little bit more tricky during that time. So definitely lean into that as one of the most positive areas that you could experience, especially in the second half of 2025. All right, so moving on, the next thing I want to talk about is there's a ton of activity this year for some reason in the financial sector of your chart, where it seems like money and possessions and finances is a major theme and a major topic for you this year. So the first transit that gives me that pushes me in that direction is that we're going to see the last eclipse take place in the sign of Aries, which is going to complete a sequence of eclipses that have been happening in that sector of your chart over the past year now, since the fall of 2023. So this series of eclipses it's been bouncing back and forth between your second house of finances and your eighth house of shared resources. So it's probably seen a series of events that represented a bunch of major beginnings and major endings when it comes to money and finances and the role of shared resources and other people's money in your life. So this sequence is going to come to a sort of culmination and a completion around the springtime in March and April, when there's one final eclipse in the sign of Aries. So this should represent a major beginning and a major ending somehow when it comes to finances for you at this time. What's interesting is that not long after that, the planets Saturn and Neptune are also going to move into your second house this year, and this is going to be the beginning of a major long-term transit, a set of long-term transits for finances that are going to last, in the case of Saturn, for the next 3 years, and in the case of Neptune for the next decade. So Saturn going into your second house can sometimes be a little bit tricky because sometimes that can represent a period of challenges where financial matters might not be running as smoothly as normal, and there may be a period where things dry up, or where you have to go through a period of restructuring when it comes to your finances. So sometimes this is just like a surmountable difficulty where an issue comes up in terms of finances, but it's something that through great striving and effort and just trying to work the problem, you're able to overcome it and then eventually become stronger as a result. So that's one of the themes when it comes to Saturn moving into your second house, especially in the middle part of 2025. And then with Neptune moving into your second house at the same time, not too long after that Aries eclipse takes place in the March-April timeframe, Neptune also moves in around that time. And This one's a little bit more tricky because Neptune usually brings a sense of nebulousness or a lack of clarity to whatever area of the chart that it's transiting. And so for you, it's bringing this nebulousness to your second house of finances, which may indicate a period in which things become less clear or in which you start developing some very idealistic ideals surrounding money and finances at this time. So there's kind of a tension here between Saturn, which is going to be pulling you in one direction of wanting you to be very pragmatic and very focused on reality, sometimes to the point of sort of pessimism, of perhaps even looking at things as being too negative, versus Neptune, which is the opposite, which is going to be pulling you in the direction of wanting to see things as being really good and being very idealistic about things, but almost to the point of being kind of disconnected from reality in some way. So this transit, which is going to become very prominent around the middle part of the year, especially around June and July, when Saturn and Neptune move in to a close conjunction where they're just under a degree away from each other, a degree from exact. I think that one of the challenges for you this year is going to be that you're going to probably swing between both of those extremes. And part of the challenge will be to try to achieve balance between where Saturn is pulling you versus where Neptune is pulling you during this time. Sometimes Saturn and Neptune is about the breaking down of boundaries, and so there may be some issues there surrounding boundaries that become prominent, especially around the summer of 2025 with respect to finances and possessions. All right, so if that wasn't enough, we also have a Venus retrograde transit this spring around the time of the eclipse that stations retrograde in your second house of finances, and then Venus backs up and moves into your first house of body, mind, self, and appearance. So this is a significant transit. With Venus going retrograde in your second house, there may be something that you have to look at and revise. There may be a person who comes back into your life at this time from the past that ends up having some sort of significant impact on your finances or your financial outlook at this time. For those of you with night charts, a Venus retrograde in your second house is probably going to be experienced as an extremely positive transit and potentially like some sort of financial windfall that happens to you around this time. This is especially around the time frame of March and April is the Aries Pisces retrograde. So Venus is going to back up into your first house of body and mind and self. And one of the most simple things that sometimes happens under Venus retrogrades in the first house is that there's something about our appearance or the way that we appear to the world that changes at this time. One notable way that this can work is sometimes people do some sort of like makeover or go through some sort of shift in appearance that's notable and important to them subjectively and somehow changes the way that they appear to other people in the world. So that's a potential with Venus going retrograde through your first house, as you might rethink the way that you present yourself to the world. This can be a positive period for making yourself look better. It can also be a positive period in terms of your body and physical vitality. So there may be something that you decide to change that in order to help improve your health and just general well-being. This can also extend sometimes to your mental state when Venus is retrograding through your first house and feeling better about your sense of self and what you need to do and what you focus on in the world. I think this is kind of positive because it's coming towards the tail end of Saturn, which has been transiting through your first house over the course of the past 2 years, since basically March of 2023, which can sometimes be a period in which health is a little bit more challenging for us. Sometimes there can be issues with our appearance during that time and things changing. So Saturn's getting ready to depart from your first house in the first and second quarter of the year, while Venus is going retrograde in your first house, which is somehow improving things. So I think this is like paving the way for Saturn to depart from your first house, which is ultimately going to be experienced as taking a load off of your shoulders or like an alleviation of some heaviness that's been there for the past couple of years. So that brings us to our next transit, which is that the eclipses are shifting from your financial axis, from your second and eighth house, and the eclipses are now shifting and moving into your first and seventh house axis, which is the axis that has to do with your sense of selfhood and who you are and your personal identity and what you want in the world, versus your seventh house of relationships and marriage and partnership and just one-on-one direct interactions with other people in your life. So this seems to be emphasizing some of the first house themes that we were just talking about and implying that you're about to go through and you're starting to go through, because actually this eclipse series first began in September of 2024, just a few months ago, with the first eclipse in Pisces. And was probably actually experienced as a little bit challenging because it was with Saturn at the same time. But you're about to go through a series of major beginnings and major endings when it comes to self versus relationships in your life. And this eclipse series is going to last for the next 2 years because it's not going to finish up until early 2027. So I think usually what I see happen when people start having eclipses in the first and seventh house is they will tend to swing back and forth between two extremes of, on the one hand, sometimes focusing a lot more energy on themselves and what you need and what you want to be doing in your life, versus sometimes you'll swing to the opposite extreme where you'll be more focused on your partner, or you'll be more focused on relationships or what other people in your life need. Sometimes the reason why we start focusing more on this dynamic is because with eclipses in the seventh, it can sometimes be a period where sometimes relationships can end, or other times major relationships can begin at this time, or sometimes both. So you may have a new relationship that comes into your life at this time, and sometimes we can start putting more emphasis on that relationship. But sometimes things can become unbalanced so that it comes at the detriment of our own needs. So one of the challenges for you that I'd really emphasize, especially this eclipse series will start in the spring, but it'll really get going in September. September is the first time that we get the first full set of eclipses in Pisces and Virgo at the same time in September of 2025. So I think that's when this axis and this tension between these two opposites is going to become the most prominent in your life, is around the September timeframe. But ultimately, once you go through this series of major beginnings and major endings, you'll probably emerge with a greater sense of balance between your first house and your sense of self and what you need in life, including things like your body and your mental well-being, and your seventh house and what kind of energy you need to put into other relationships in your life and what role you want those to play in your life overall. So you should emerge from this series of eclipses ultimately with a better sense of balance between those two things. So that seems actually really great. And that's one of my final transits that I meant to mention this year in terms of the outlook and the transits for Pisces rising for 2025. Actually, there's one more major transit that I almost forgot to mention, which is that the slow-moving outer planet, Uranus, is moving into your fourth house of home and family and living situations starting in July. And it's going to be there for the entire second half of the year. And this is a really significant transit because it's going to last for something like the next 7 years through the early part of the next decade. And we're going to get a preview of it in the second half of 2025. So Uranus is the planet of sudden change and rebellion and innovation and also in freedom. And it's moving into your fourth house, which represents your home and living situation and private life, as well as your relationship with your family and especially your parents. So both of these are some areas that may be subject to change during the course of this transit. So with the home and living situation thing, at home you could see some unexpected changes and disruptions potentially in the sphere of the home and living situation where things move or start changing somewhat quickly or somewhat unexpectedly. So sometimes this can mean something like you end up changing your home and living situation in a way that's radically different than what you had prior to this time. So that doesn't necessarily have to be bad or good necessarily, but just something that is very different in terms of your home and living situation compared to what you've had up to this point in your life. So sometimes you may have the urge for freedom and to get rid of previous restraints that have been holding you back when it comes to your living situation for a while. So in some instances, there's people where if there's some place that they've always wanted to live, they'll just suddenly get rid of everything and drop everything in order to go and move to a new location suddenly. And this can sometimes feel, or you can feel this sense of like liberation or freedom or other themes like that can actually feel good, even if it also feels a little bit unsettling or a little bit erratic. So that quality of erraticness is something that may come into play. But ultimately, it should be good in that it should free you up in order to end up in a living situation that's more authentic to yourself. With Uranus going through the fourth house, there can also be some unexpected changes at home when it comes to the family and especially the parents. So sometimes this can mean your parents start behaving erratically, or they have a sudden urge for freedom or for pursuing new goals or other things like that, which can sometimes, from your perspective, seem a little bit unsettling. Some of these disruptions can sometimes, impact your relationship with them or your relationship with family members at this time. But sometimes it's good to just give them space if they have to pursue some of those feelings of like freedom and liberation and doing what's authentic to them, because that's kind of necessary in order to live out their own transits at this time. Other times there can be, unexpected changes when it comes to what your interaction with your parents and your relationship with them. Sometimes this can come from within you, where suddenly you might be feeling more rebellious in terms of your interactions and your relationship with them. And some of those relationships then sometimes can be distant at different points during the course of a transit like this. But usually people go through that process of like seeking liberation and freedom, and then eventually things will settle down and sort of achieve a new sense of normalcy once the new boundaries have been pushed when it comes to not just your relationship with your parents, but also with your living situation as well. So it can be a very exciting and very liberating transit. This is just the first initial preview of it in the second half of 2025, when Uranus dips into Gemini and moves into your fourth house in the second half of the year. And then eventually in 2026, it's going to come back into Taurus in your third house of communication for a little bit before going fully back into Gemini after that. But what's nice about the second half of 2025 is it should give us a very nice preview of some of these energies and what some of the changes and what some of the revolutions are when it comes to your home and living situation, as well as your relationship with your parents. All right, so that's it for this forecast. If you're looking for more specifics or you're looking for good dates to do things next year, I just released my 2025 electional astrology report, where I go through the next 12 months and I identify the single best dates each month in order to initiate actions or to take actions and launch new ventures and undertakings using the principles of electional astrology. So people have used my past year's reports to do important things or schedule important things in their life, like getting married, starting a new business, taking a major trip or journey, and other significant things like that. So if you're looking for a report to schedule and plan things for next year, then this would be the one for you. I actually am running a 20% off sale just after launch, which goes through the first week of January. So if you'd like to get access to the report for 20% less than what it's going to cost next year, then you can get it right now at theastrologypodcast.com/2025report. All right, that's it for this forecast. So good luck in 2025, and I'll see you again next year. I just released my 2025 astrology calendar posters, which show all of the major astrological transits this year at a glance, and you can get those at theastrologypodcast.com/merch. If you want to learn more about my approach to astrology, then I teach an online course in ancient astrology called the Hellenistic Astrology Course, which has hundreds of hours of video lectures where I teach people how to read birth charts and how to understand and predict the future using transits and other timing techniques. So you can find out more information at theastrologyschool.com. Also, shout out to our sponsor for this episode, which is the Northwest Astrology Conference, which is happening in May of 2025 in Seattle, Washington, and it's being simultaneously streamed online at the same time. So you can find out more information at norwac.net. Finally, thanks to the patrons that helped to support the production of this episode of the Astrology Podcast through my page on Patreon. You can get early access to new episodes plus other bonus content by becoming a patron at patreon.com/astrologypodcast.